So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about bits of suspension, and these bits I've got in front of me here are track control rods. Now Triumph did a very good job of designing the suspension on TRs, but there were some errors. And were they errors or were they not errors? You could call them errors today, but there were probably financial constraints in the day. So these two components here are the track control arms from a TR2, 3, 3A or a TR3B. This face here sits on the suspension, on the upright in fact, between the lower trunnion and the top ball joint, and as you can see both of them have got this flat surface here. Now what that does is transmit the motion from side to side of the steering control mechanism. In the case of the original car that would be the steering box, and when this moves from side to side, then this baby here moves the wheel around what effectively is called a kingpin, but is in fact a trunnion and a ball joint at the top, but effectively they form what's generally known as the kingpin. And then wheels move out and back in according to the steering wheel movement. So why do we need to make an alteration? And we have made an alteration. We've designed these different ones here. These are called still called track control arms, but they have a different arrangement. And why would we need to do that? Okay, so when Triumph designed the car in 1950 sort of time, just after the Second World War, financial constraints were really important. And so I suspect, and we can only guess because we weren't there at the time, that Triumph were not allowed to put an anti-roll bar on the car through financial considerations, and consequently they decided to get over something that had to be with the car, and that was a stiff rear suspension setup because of the nature of the chassis. Ken Richardson, who was the the lead designer at the time, he'd been told by Black, who was the MD, when he was given the prototype to drive, he called it the worst car he'd ever driven. And so Black said, okay, didn't say smart ass, but he might have said that if it was today, come and take a job and fix it. So he set about fixing things, and without a front anti-roll bar, he had to find some way of making the car understeer a little compared with the oversteer that's provided by the stiff springs at the rear. And so by doing so, he changed the Ackerman angle from what would be normal to a negative installation. Ackerman angle, what does that mean? Well, if you take the line between the vertical link we were just talking about, which is the kingpin, that's its technical name, and the relationship between the angle of the vertical link and the outer ball joints, which are attached here, is such that if you strike a line between here and the centre of the vertical link, then you would expect those two lines from the left and the right to meet in the centre of the differential of the car. On Triumph's arrangement, they do meet in the centre of a differential, but not yours. It's the car in front. Why would they do that? Well, because that introduces a weird setup where the inner wheel strikes a larger circle than the outer wheel. And that introduces a strange arrangement of understeer, which you wouldn't normally want to have on a car, but if you're trying to cheaply counter the arrangement of the stiff rear end, then it actually works. Well, with modern tyres and different arrangements, then at the moment we can, or in today, we can make an arrangement whereby we can change that. It's not easy because you'd hope that the design of the car was such that you could have the ball joints further out, which would make that line meet in the diff. But unfortunately the disc or the drum is in the way. However, it's just about doable. So Revington TR have redesigned this component into these two new components, and they look much the same, except that they are in fact slightly different insofar as the positioning of this ball joint here is actually 30 millimeters further outboard. And what that does is mean that the Ackerman angle is actually correct, so that the ball joint to kingpin line does meet in your diff and not somebody else's. So that means you get toe out on turns. Now, toe out on turns is where one wheel, the inner wheel, moves further round than the outer wheel, so the circle described by the inner wheel is smaller than the wheel on the outboard. Well, you'd expect that because they're going round in a circle, and the width of the car means that you'd want one wheel to be going round a bigger circle than the other, and this allows that to happen. So when you combine that with other concepts within the suspension, you get much better suspension and steering control. How does this work on the car? Well, this ball joint gets pretty close to the disc or to the drum, and there is a kit. The kit is part number RTR3714K if you want to purchase it, and includes all the components to connect these two chappies to the steering of the standard car. That's with a steering box. But the instructions do say that you have to, like with the TR4, you have to cut away part of the shield that protects the disc. And in fact, Triumph had to do just the same when they decided to correct this on the TR4. If you have drums, well, you just have to cut a little bit out of the back plate of the drum. That does no harm, but it allows space for the ball joint to fit. And so when you've done that, you end up with a car that handles so much better. And of course, if Triumph had been able to have an anti-roll bar in their day, they probably would have done this in the first place, because they were not stupid and they knew what they were doing. So if you want your suspension to work properly, you need to buy these within a kit, and the kit part number is RTR3714K. But if you want to do the job really well, you need to buy a suspension package. A suspension package incorporates these, but it gives the right springs and the right anti-roll bar, springs at the rear, and also all the bushes, as well as an anti-roll bar at the rear. Now, this isn't just a bunch of components that have been stuck together out of a catalogue. This is actually a suspension package, which we call an integrated suspension package, and that package was designed by a suspension designer way back in 1993. You'd think we'd have been able to improve on something by now, but not. He had a very rudimentary computer-aided design package at the time, which was, for the day, it was fantastic. But it allowed him to put in all the Cartesian points of the suspension and then work out how the suspension could be altered. And that package includes a lot of nice little components that improve the suspension, such that you have a fantastic ride without the suspension being harsh, and you don't compromise any ground clearance as well. So that part number for that suspension package is RTR3105PK. There are others as well, but if you went to go and have a look at that on our website, which is www.revingtontr.com, then you're going to find that package, this little package here, and you'll find all sorts of other things about suspension that make your car work wonderfully.